Okay, page 243. Please rise. Yes, it is. Okay, please rise. Jesus Christ is the light of the world, the light no darkness can overcome. Stay with us, Lord, for it is evening, and the day is almost over. Let your light scatter the darkness and illumine your church. Joyous light of glory of the immortal Father, heavenly, holy, blessed Jesus Christ. We have come to the setting of the sun, and we look to the evening light. We sing to God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You are worthy of being praised with pure voices forever. O Son of God, O Giver of life, the universe proclaims your glory. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who led your people Israel by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Enlighten our darkness by the light of your Christ. May his word be a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. For you are merciful, and you love your whole creation. And we, your creatures, glorify you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. We'll sing Psalm 141. Let us pray. Let the incense of our repentant prayer ascend before you, O Lord, And let your loving kindness descend on us, that, with purified minds, we may sing your praises with the church on earth and the whole heavenly host, and may glorify you forever. Amen. All right. We are on the last class for Judges. So we're going to be covering sort of 4 chapters. I mean, we're going to look at what happened in these 4 chapters. We won't be able to cover it quite as in detail as we did the last several chapters. If you've read this, you might have a bit of a queasy feeling. I mean, this part of the Bible does not appear in any of the readings on Sunday morning. The Bible is not part of our CPH, Sunday school curriculum either. And if you wanted it to be, you'd have to edit it out so that it'd be very short indeed. Okay, we wonder what's going on. So we're going to take a look at this and kind of take a brutal assessment of what this is saying about the age. The first thing I'll point out is most of what we've been doing in Judges have been chronological. I mean, Deborah came before Gideon, and Gideon came before Jephthah, and Jephthah came before Samson. And basically we covered the Judges in chronological order. When we get to chapter 17, it's not chronological anymore. Probably there's evidence in here that this actually goes back to the beginning of the book of Judges. Probably chronologically it fits more there. But the point of this is not so much where it fits chronologically. The point of it is it's just sort of describing other aspects of the relationships of the tribes to one another. That's an important theme here. Do we have Israel, or do we have 12 separate tribes? And then a little bit about the general morality of the land. And morality, not only sexual morality, we're going to see some pretty loose standards there, but also the religious observance is not at all what you would expect from people who not very long ago had been following the tabernacle with the cloud and pillar of fire. Not long ago had been under the direct leadership of Moses, and now things have really degenerated. So we're going to get a lot of clues to that. We're going to take a look at 2 tribes particularly, Dan and Benjamin. And we'll see why Dan is important, what it's talking about there, and then we'll take a look at what happened to Benjamin in terms of in the story here. Before we begin, does anybody have any general observations? Yeah.
I've got more of a question. It didn't seem like any of these people were judges.
No, it's not.
Leaders of any.
There's no judges in here. That's right.
Okay.
It's giving you. Well, you'll see what it's talking about in Dan. Why it's telling us this tale about Dan has to do with Dan's future as a tribe, but also a shrine that ends up in Dan that becomes important. So it's giving us a little background for how that came to be. And Benjamin, this was a sad situation where essentially 11 of the tribes got together and almost annihilated the 12th tribe. Okay. But we'll also see, because you're right, there aren't any judges here. There's no leadership here. You don't see any of that. The characters that you do get introduced to are not judges. They're not leaders in any sense. Nor do you see anybody that you would say, well, no, there is a courageous and moral individual. Nothing like that. Okay. This is not telling us how it ought to be. It's telling us how it was and how it ought not to have been. Okay? So we are also getting a picture of what happens to the people of God when you stray from the Word of God, you end up in a nauseating world of ugliness and moral chaos, and that's exactly what happened here. Now, all of Judges is sort of like that, but it gives a more, persistent picture of the evil. Well, let's put it this way. How many times did we hear that the people of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and then it goes on? But it doesn't describe, it doesn't get underneath that. It just says the people of Israel did evil. We're going to get a little bit more about what kinds of things were going on here, okay? I call this an epilogue because these last 4 chapters are sort of like that. I guess it's 5 chapters, are just sort of a cap off the era of the judges, so you have a little bit of a sense for what it was like, not just with the hero judges or the particular incidents that we've looked at, but a more sort of a dreary palette of life. Okay. All right. First, we're going to look at Dan. And to give you the broad strokes here, Dan was one of the 12 tribes, and when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, they were apportioned out which tribe would go and live where. And Dan's region was just next just to the north and just to the west of Judah and against the ocean, just north of the Philistines. Samson came from the Dan. He was a Danite, okay? So in the southern part along the coast is where Dan was, okay? But if you look at maps, particularly later maps, you find out that Dan seems to be way up in the north, okay? And sometimes you'll look at a map and you'll see Dan in 2 places, down in the south and up in the north, as though it had 2 different land grants. It didn't. It had the southern land grant, and then it decided that it didn't want to live there. Now, presumably this is because they were right next to the Philistines, and we'd already seen how the Philistines were just a real problem. So the Danites decided that they were going to scope out and see if they could find someplace better to live. That's kind of behind all of this. And they end up taking a town called Laish, which is way up north of the Sea of, what will later become the Sea of Galilee. They capture this town and they move up there, okay? And that will become the home of a new shrine, but we'll get to that in just a second. First off, let's begin by meeting Micah here and see what he's all about and wonder about this. This is 17, verse 1. There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah, and he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me, I took it." Okay, so this is a little bit, I think that this is the way of the biblical author to show us the very unseemly beginnings of this shrine in Dan. It starts with some money that Micah stole, and his mother cursed whoever stole it, not knowing it was his own son. So he confesses, and she finds out it's him, and of course she's cursed him, but then she decides to devote this money to the Lord instead, so perhaps make it a little bit better for her son. This is what happens then. And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." So she tries to bless him because he's stolen the money, and she issued a curse. And he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, "I dedicate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son to make a carved image and a metal image." Okay, so right away we have problems. We have stolen money, a curse, and then we have a carved and metal image is ultimately going to come of that. So even when she supposedly devotes this money to the Lord and blesses her son, it's still, this is just not the way it's supposed to be in the land of Canaan. "Now therefore I will restore it to you." So when he restored the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith. And he made a carved image and a metal image, and it was in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod. Remember, Gideon made an ephod too, sort of a breast piece. That was some kind of a holy garment. I mean, we don't know what all the religious implications of this, but clearly they considered it to have some kind of religious significance. He made an ephod and household gods, and ordained one of his sons who became his priest. So he needed a priest for a shrine. And now we have all kinds of problems here. As far as the law of Moses, we are just really drawing outside the lines here. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Well, that is a refrain. Verse 6 says that, and then chapter 18, verse 1, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. And then 19:1, it says, in those days when there was no king in Israel. And then our whole passage finishes up. In those days, this is 21, verse 25. In those days there was no king of Israel in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So, once again, the text is describing what was supposed to be done, or what actually happened, not what was supposed to be done. As we read that little passage, right away we realize, okay, number one, first commandment. You shall have no other gods. You should not make any graven image of any god, of anything in heaven above or earth beneath. Or what. That's number one. Number two, under Moses, it was made very, very clear that there was to be one place of worship. The Lord will choose that place of worship. Okay? So you were to worship at the tabernacle. The tabernacle would later be built into a permanent structure, and then we would call it a temple. But before that, it was a tabernacle, or sometimes called a tent of meeting. It was a tent, and it was a portable structure. However, at this time, this portable structure spent most of its time in a little town called Shiloh. Okay? Shiloh, when you hear references to Shiloh in the Old Testament, depending on where you are reading, you are either reading about where the tabernacle is or where the tabernacle was. Shiloh eventually was destroyed. The tabernacle was destroyed there, and the ark was captured. Do you remember when that happened? That was in 1 Samuel, and that was when the Philistines attacked. And they took remember they took the ark, and they had it for a while, and it didn't go well for them. He sent it back, okay? But at that time, Shiloh got destroyed. And by the way, this is confusing now. Later Micah, that's the prophet Micah, prophesied about the temple, that it would be destroyed. And he likened what would happen to the temple in Jerusalem to Shiloh. Go, he says, go and look at Shiloh and see. And so he's basically telling the Israelites, if you think that the Lord will not destroy this temple, go to Shiloh and see. And you will see what will happen, what he can do to this temple. Jeremiah said exactly the same thing. All right. So we've got a shrine. He's designated a priest, his own son. Just take somebody and make him a priest. You can't do that. God designated that the house or offspring, the descendants of Aaron, would be priests. And Levites would serve the priests, and the priests would actually offer sacrifices in the authorized place, the sanctuary, which at this time would have been at Shiloh. Sometimes it was at Bethel. Those two weren't very far apart. And so sometimes you'll hear about Bethel. They go into the Lord to inquire at Bethel. That's because the tabernacle was sometimes there. So, but he's got his own private shrine. Got his own private priest, his son. Good deal if you can get it. So we realize that we're not paying much attention to anything that Moses said religiously. Of course, we already have a thief, and we have a curse. Verse 7, now there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite. We're going to meet a Levite. Now the Levites were designated by God to assist with the priests in the tabernacle, but you weren't really doing your job as a Levite unless you were there at the tabernacle. However, they didn't need all the Levites at the tabernacle all the time, so what would happen is a certain number of the Levites would be apportioned to be serving at the tabernacle at any particular time, and the rest of the time you wouldn't be there. So you would have your tour of duty, so to speak, that you'd be involved in that. The rest of the time there were particular places where the Levites lived, but they were not granted a tribe like the rest. So they had no land or other occupation that would generally support them. There were certain cities that were cities for the Levites, and the Levites also made much of their living from the offerings that were brought to the tabernacle, and we've got this Levite wandering around, okay? So he's not really doing anything. But they did recognize that the Levite was somehow or another sort of a person set apart. What you need to understand, though, is a Levite is not a priest. All priests were Levites, but most Levites were not priests, okay? And as he journeyed, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. And Micah said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I'm a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to sojourn where I can find a place." And Micah said to him, "Stay with me, and be to me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, and a suit of clothes for your living." The Levite went in, and the Levite was content to dwell with the man. And the young man became to him like one of his sons. And Micah ordained the Levite. And the young man became a priest, and was in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will prosper me, because I have a Levite as a priest." Okay? So what we have here is no regard whatsoever for actually what had been established under the law of Moses, or what the Levitical work was actually supposed to be, or what priests were actually supposed to do. There's no regard for that at all. It's much more of a pagan idea. I have a shrine, I have a priest, I have a quality priest. He's an actual, real-life, bona fide Levite. So this is a good thing. And the Lord's going to prosper me because I have these things. These very pagan ideas that have kind of crept in. And here we have Micah. Now, we don't know anything else about Micah than that, except he has a nice shrine and a bona fide Levite to be his personal priest. Okay? So there you have it. Now, what happens next is the Danites decide that they're tired of fighting with the Philistines and trying to eke out a living. They're complaining essentially that they have no land. They were allotted this land, but we can't live here. And so they send out a group of 5 individuals to go and seek out. Apparently, it doesn't say this, but we have to assume that they went up to north of the Sea of Galilee for some reason or another. There's this town up there, Laish. And the spies went up there and looked at it. But before they went there, they were passing through the hill country of Ephraim. Okay, so they were going from Dan up here to the north. But about here, they come to the hill country of Ephraim and Micah's house. So they basically pull in and stay for a day, and they see this Levite. And it says they recognize his voice, probably meant his dialect or something like that. "Oh, so you're not from around here, but we recognize where you come from." And they have this nice conversation, and the Levite tells them about what he does here. "Here's Micah, and I'm his priest, and this is our shrine, and isn't this fine and dandy?" And the Levite seems to give the blessing of the Lord. They ask him, "Should we go up there and proceed on our mission?" And the Levite seems to give him the Lord's blessing. And so anyway, they leave, and they go up, and they spy out this Laish, and they determine that this Laish is a peaceful town, not in any kind of alliances, not encumbered with anybody else, just sort of minding their own business. It mentions that they're unsuspecting, unprotected, and they decide that they would like this land. Okay, so they come back with this report back to the original area of Dan where they left from, and they said, "This place is wonderful. I vote that we go up there, capture that city, and let's get out of here." Okay, that's what they did. They gathered up 600 of their armed soldiers and their families, and they set up by caravan, but they go through the hill country of Ephraim again, because that's how you have to go from Dan up to Laish. You have to go through there, and they stop by Mr. Micah's house again. And when they get there, things take on an interesting turn. Essentially, 600 soldiers and their families are gathered outside the gate of Micah's house, and the 5 guys that were there before come on in. And there's the priest, and he's happy to see them. But then the 5 guys walk right in the house, and what do? They begin to take the household gods and the carved images and the ephod and all of that. They just start gathering it up. Why? Because they want it. And so as they're coming out with all of this stuff, the priest says, "What do you do with all that stuff?" And they basically said, "You keep your mouth quiet. As a matter of fact, we've got a job for you. How would you like to be our priest and our Levite and come and serve us in our shrine, seeing how we have all the stuff that you used to serve there?" And what does the Levite do? Remember, the text says that he had become like a son to Micah. But what he says, he's very happy. That'd be wonderful. And so he gathers up and goes with him. And so they all leave. And as they are leaving, with the priest and the shrine and all the stuff at the shrine. Micah finds out about this and gathers up some of the others in the area, and they go after the guys from Dan and to stop them. Basically, you're taking all of my stuff. And they come out there and they said, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing with all my stuff? And essentially the Danites, with the 600 armed soldiers, said, and what are you going to do about it? That's essentially what they said. What are you going to do about it? I said, if you make too much noise, it might go badly for you, so why don't you just be quiet and go home? And Micah looked at the situation and sized it up and decided that they probably had the best idea here, and he went home. And that's the last we hear of Micah. And the Danites go up and they conquer Laish, and they set up a shrine there. And their priest is there. So at the end of, let's look at chapter 18, verse 27. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon. They were Sidonian, apparently ethnically, but too far away from Sidon to have any kind of connection with them. And they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it, and they named the city Dan. So if you look at the Holy Land, you'll see in Jesus' day or in earlier, there's a city up there way north of the Sea of Galilee called Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel, that is, to Jacob. Okay, Jacob had 12 sons, and one of the sons' name was Dan. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up a carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom. Now, I keep calling him the Levite, but here we learn the Levite's name. His name is Jonathan. Now, here's even something more spectacular. Jonathan, the son of Gershom. And then Gershom is the son of Moses. Moses had a son named Gershom. I mean, the Moses had a son named Gershom. And so the question is Jonathan the great-grandson of Moses? Or do we just have a coincidence that it just happens to have another set of names like that? And his sons were priests in the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. The captivity of the land is talking about there is almost for sure when the Philistines came in and rolled over Shiloh and took the ark, not the later captivities that we'll hear about. So this is very interesting. So what you have here is you have a description of one of the tribes that sets up its own shrine. And that shrine has its own priesthood. And the priesthood is not of the order of Aaron. And the shrine is not in the place which God designated. And they just set it up on their own. And we learned the backstory to this, that it all has its beginning in a theft and a curse and a weaselly little man named Micah and his Levite. But this little this business about Jonathan and his descendants continuing to serve as priests to the tribe of Dan, I mean, that would have gone on close to 300 years. So think about that. So this was a burr and a problem in Israel that the Israelites did not quickly forget. That's why we have this story here. A little later on, this story does not connect to that, but you can't help but to see the connection. David was the first king to rule, well, I guess Saul ruled over a united Israel, barely. But David actually reigned over united Israel, and then his son Solomon. And then after Solomon died, Rehoboam took over, and then, remember, the kingdom split. Rehoboam in the south and was sat on the throne of David, and then Jeroboam, who had been a general, he was in the north and king over the north. And Jeroboam determined that he cannot possibly govern a kingdom and maintain the northern kingdom, Ephraim, they tended to call it, separately, and have everybody in the northern tribes traipsing down to Jerusalem every year, or because by that time the tabernacle had been moved to Jerusalem, and then the temple had been built there. he couldn't possibly maintain a separate northern kingdom if the entire northern kingdom was beholden to the priesthood and the temple in Judah. Okay, so what did he do? He created two new tribes, actually two new shrines, essentially, two new temples, one in Ephraim, one in Dan, up north. And by the way, he placed in them a carved image of a golden calf. Okay, it's kind of interesting there too. So Dan figures in there too that they still have, and probably, I mean, it's hard not to see a connection there, that Dan had been maintaining kind of a separate, priesthood and ministry all of its own. So they were pretty comfortable having Jeroboam set up a rival temple to the temple in the south. So that's later history. We don't get into that here. All right, so that's 17 and 18, and it gives us this sordid story that tells us why Dan has a shrine, and you're supposed to know why this shrine is an ugly abomination and totally contrary to what God had established under Moses. Any thoughts on this?
Is this where the Samaritans came from?
Oh, well, I mean,
because of the differences, because of the Pentateuch, they believe.
There's a lot of things that happened between here and what became the Samaritans. The Samaritans did come from that region of Ephraim and north, but particularly in Ephraim. But they were a product of later invasions, the Assyrian invasion, which wouldn't happen for another probably 400 or 500 years. And the Assyrians basically seeded when they conquered, they would take peoples from different conquered regions and they would move them. So they would take people conquered from here and move them here to another region that they conquered, and take the people from here that they conquered and move them over here. In other words, mix the populations around in order to vitiate the kind of nationalism and ethnic rivalry that the Syrians didn't want to deal with. So what happened was, in that area, you had a mixture of people that the Assyrians had conquered from other places, moved in there. Now, you did have some aspect that the northern tribes had always had kind of this rebellious religion. And so what you ended up with in Samaria was a partly this northern version of the law of Moses, with additional things added to it from various regions of the world that the Assyrians had conquered, plus centuries and centuries of living separately from Judah and the Jews. So a lot of things went into what would later become a Samaritan. But you do already see that rivalry, and that is that the Judah is always going to see itself as the keepers of the real flame, okay, in time, because of David, because of the temple, because of the promise of God to David and to his descendants, and because Jerusalem had been chosen by God as the place where my name will dwell. That's how it was put in Deuteronomy. And so whatever you might say about the northern tribes, the fact that they weren't in the south was not the problem. The fact that they set up a sort of a rival religion was. Okay? So that feeds into it, but it becomes much worse later on. Okay? But it starts out pretty bad now. Now that was the good story. That was the happy story. Okay? The next story is less happy. It begins at chapter 19. We meet another Levite. I don't know, these Levites were mischief makers. Chapter 19, verse 1, in those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite. Now this is a different Levite. But it happened that he was sojourning in the hill country of Ephraim. And he took himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. All right, so again, you just have, it's a different age, it's a different situation. He's got a concubine. A concubine was sort of like a wife. He sort of treats her like a wife, but less than a wife. So it doesn't mention that he has another wife. He just has this concubine, and don't ask me any more about it, as I have no idea. But she's introduced to us as a concubine. Not just a concubine. Turns out that she was a faithless concubine. Verse 2 says, and his concubine was unfaithful to him. So apparently she had an affair. and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah. So interesting that we have two Levites both connected to Bethlehem in Judah. It seems to be just a coincidence. So she is unfaithful to her, I guess is a husband. They later called a husband. And so she's unfaithful. He gets angry. She takes off and goes back home to Dad. He, after a few months, decides to go get her. And so he comes with I don't know, remember what he took, a donkey or something. Anyway, he goes down to Dad's house, and he's going to fetch his concubine and bring her back home again. And Dad is ecstatic because this was a great shame for him that his wife had been given the boot, essentially. But the husband is willing to take her back, and this will lift a great shame off of his family. So he's just happy as a clam. And there is the Levite comes down there to reclaim and bring back his wife, and he wants to just get her and leave, but apparently Dad is just a very sociable fellow, so he's constantly inviting him to stay and stay and stay, and he won't let him go. And so it was supposed to be a very quick visit, turns out to last several days, and then finally he gets away. He's got this little narrative, it's kind of a humorous little narrative where he just doesn't want to let him go. And they seem to be having a good time. The guy seems to be staying and enjoying himself, but finally, I got to go. And he leaves, but he leaves kind of late in the day. And because of that, he can't make it very far. So here he is riding back. He's going back home, and he's got his concubine with him and his servants and whatnot. And they say, hey, let's stop here. And they were passing by a town called Jebus, and this is the earlier name for Jerusalem. But Jerusalem had not yet been conquered by the Israelites, so it was not an Israelite town. And so the Levite says, so we're not staying here. We're going to stay with one of our brothers. Okay? So we're going to stay in an Israelite town. So he proceeds on a little bit further, and he ends up coming to a little town called Gibeah. Gibeah was an Israelite town. It was a Benjaminite town. By the way, Benjamin is right north of Judah. Benjamin was always a much smaller tribe. Judah was always a much larger tribe. In the end, Judah will end up kind of swallowing up Benjamin. And so Benjamin stops being a tribe that has any land or anything, although you have some important people that came from Benjamin. Saul came from Benjamin, and later Saul of Tarsus, or Paul, would identify himself as of the tribe of Benjamin as well. Okay, but at this time, they stop at Gibeah. Now, what's important to note is that in that day and age, you didn't let people just. If somebody came into your village, somebody is going to have to give them hospitality. You will die. It's not like there's a Hotel 6 everywhere you go. So if a little town like this will not help out a fellow Israelite, this is a very great shame. We learn that they go into town and sit in the square. They're waiting for an invitation for somebody to take them in, and they just stay there. And nobody ever invites them in. It says nobody ever takes them in. So they're just sitting there in the square waiting to see what's going to happen next. We learn that an old man comes in, and this old man is not from Benjamin, but apparently has taken up residence in the town for some reason or another, either permanent or long-term. And he sees this man, and he says, I'll take you in. And so he takes him in. It's an old man. Don't know his name. Now, what happens next is horrifying. What happens next sounds an awful lot like Genesis chapter 19. You know what I'm referring to in Genesis chapter 19? Yeah, that's Sodom. What happened to Lot? Remember the two angels came and looking like men, but they were angels. And when they were in Sodom, all the men of Sodom gathered around the house where Lot was staying and demanded the men because they wanted to have sex with them. And, of course, this becomes the precursor for bad things happening to Sodom that are known even to this day. Okay, well, there's a very similar thing as what's happening here. The residents, well, it says some worthless fellows of the town decide that they want this fellow, this Levite. Now, here you get some very strange stuff. On the one hand, the old man who takes the Levite and has got a daughter, he's got a daughter, and he's taken this Levite and his concubine servants in. He has a near absolute obligation to protect those who he has taken in. Okay, so since he takes them into his house, and these guys, these worthless fellows from the village, demand that he surrender this Levite so that they can have their way with him, and it is inconceivable to him that he could do that, surrender him. He is my guest and under my protection. I cannot do it. Okay, so hero, that's a good thing. But what does he decide to do? Here, take my daughter and take his concubine instead. And we're horrified at that. Well, we should be horrified at that. We're not being told that hospitality is so important you should surrender your daughter to the mob, rather than what we're told is this is awful, this is terrible what is happening. Better all of you go down in flames than to do a thing like that. Now here we get a kind of a little insight into this poor concubine, her situation, because eventually they work out a deal with these guys. Here, have my concubine, and he basically throws her out. The daughter, I guess, doesn't ever have to go out, but the concubine goes out, and she's abused all night long. Again, we are learning what was, not what should have been. Nobody's supposed to be reading this and imagining that somehow or another we're getting a picture of real moral heroism or any kind of spirituality. We're not. We are getting just the opposite. This is happening in Israel. Israel is acting like Sodom. Now, the next morning, the Levite comes out, and there's his poor concubine / wife, and we don't know whether she's dead or not. He just tells her to get up, and she doesn't move. So the mass of tenderness from this man, having seen what happens, you kind of get the sense that, I mean, well, let's just say he doesn't have any real sympathy for her. He went down to get her, and that seemed like a good story, but now we're finding out that actually I don't think he cared about her at all. He gathers up her body, puts it on a donkey. I don't know whether she was alive or dead at that time, but presumably by the time he gets home, she's dead by then. This is what he does next. He carves her into little pieces. 12 pieces, to be precise. And he sends a little package. You would think that this was like The Godfather or something like that. It is a little of that. He sends a package to each of the 12 tribes with a little message in it, essentially, basically saying, look what these people in Benjamin did. Look what they did to me. We have got to exterminate this group. And so we don't know what was in the message. You know, we can only imagine. At any rate, the various tribes get this and are quite alarmed and outraged. And they gather in a little town called Mitzpah, not very far away, in response to this basically call to arms. I guess I've kind of moved on, haven't I? There we go. There's our gruesome call to arms. Now, so 11 of the tribes gather together. They learn the story from Levite and from the Levite and the others that were there, what happened, and they are absolutely outraged. They mustered like 400,000 soldiers, according to the text, to do this, bring justice, basically. They demand that the people of Gibeah surrender the people who did this, and the Benjamites instead come out and defend Gibeah and defend these people. And so now we have a standoff between 11 tribes and 400,000, and it was about 26,000 or so from Benjamin. Benjamin was a much smaller tribe, and they're facing off with one another. Okay. The 11 tribes are so angry that they make a vow. This becomes important. They make a vow that none of us are going to give our daughters to these Benjaminites in marriage. Okay, that will become important. They make this vow, we're never going to do it. They can never marry our daughters. They proceed to go to war. And the Benjaminites thrash them. And then they attack again, and they get thrashed again. And then they go to Bethel, and they prostrate themselves before the Lord, and they weep, and they repent, and they seek the Lord's guidance and strength. And he says, go. The Lord says, go. I'll deliver them into your hands. And then they go back. And the third time is the charm. What they did is, rather than just attack like they did before, they exercised some thinking. They set up their main force in front of Gibeah as before, and then they had a secondary force that was off to the side waiting in ambush. Okay? And so they were hidden. And so what happened was the main force acted like they were going to attack, and then the Benjaminites came out to attack them. The Benjaminites had already whooped them twice, and so they gave ground immediately and began to retreat, and the Benjaminites assumed that they were about to whip them a third time. So the Benjaminites give chase to the main battle, and meanwhile, then the ambushers come in and wipe out the city. And then apparently go through the towns and cities, nearly wiping out all of Benjamin. Once the soldiers from Benjamin who were chasing the main army see behind them the smoke rising up from the city they were supposed to be protecting, they realize that all was lost, and about that time, the main Israel army turns around and attacks, and so now they're in a rout. 600 of them survive, and they end up going up into a hill in sort of a heavily fortified protective area where they can kind of hold off the enemy. And Israel basically butchers all the rest of them. So there's 600 left. Benjamin is nearly extinguished. They are so concerned, the other 11 tribes, that the violence that they had visited upon Benjamin had been so extreme, and they had so thoroughly wiped out almost all of Benjamin, that they began to really become upset and weep at what they'd done. They nearly wiped out an entire tribe. There are 600 men left of Benjamin. That's it. And then they realized that they had another problem. This is where it gets surreal, comical, and horrifying all at the same time. Here's the problem. The problem is that Israel had made a vow. All these tribes that had gathered together to punish Benjamin had made a vow that they weren't going to give any of their daughters to the men of Benjamin. Well, all we have left of Benjamin is 600 men. How is Benjamin going to survive? They need wives and don't have any. What are we going to do? We can't break our vow. What does that sound like, by the way? Can't break our vow. Yeah, it sounds like Jephthah. And a little bit of Samson. That's correct. Also, this kind of mechanistic sort of, I've got a shrine, God will protect me now. This sort of thing. Again, it's very, very pagan. But anyway, here's their conundrum. And so they wonder, well, what can we do? Among them, they realized, let's find some family or some clan that did not gather with us at Mizpah, because they would not have made this vow that we made. And so, what was their name? Who was it that should have written this down? Like Jabesh. Well, I wish I'd written it down and I didn't. Jabesh Gilead. That's right. Jabesh Gilead did not. They weren't there. So that they're not bound by the vow. So And they were on the other side of the Jordan River, okay, but they were still part of Israel. So Israel attacked them and took 400 of their wives to deliver over to the Benjaminites, who otherwise would not have any wives. And they justified that by saying, hey, they didn't make the vow, so we didn't break our vow by taking their women. Okay? Now, of course, this is horrifying, right? We also have another problem. There were 600 men, and there were only 400 women, so we need 200 more. Now what do we do? Verse 16 of chapter 21, when the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for the wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe may not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them the wives from our own daughters," because they had made this vow. And so there's still 200 men of Benjamin who are not going to be able to get any wives. Pardon?
Couldn't they just go to somewhere outside of Israel to get?
Well, you're not supposed to do that. But I mean, the thing is, you can think of so many things that would have been better than what they do.
And that would have been one of them.
Okay, or just be patient and repopulate with the 400 you have. Well, okay, so this is what they decide to do. Verse 19 says, "Behold, there is a yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh." Okay, so one of the feasts of the Lord there at the tabernacle of the Lord, which is north of Bethel. Verse 20, "And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch, and if the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances," apparently part of the festival, "then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man a wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin." So just take one of them and then flee back to Benjamin, and you'll be okay. Now, see why this isn't in our Sunday school material? Verse 22. "And when their fathers and their brothers come to complain to us," they're going to complain. "We will say to them, Grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle." So we made a vow, and we didn't break our vow by getting a wife for you in battle. "And neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty." They had made the vow, but they didn't give their daughters. Their daughters were captured, okay? So this ends this sordid little deal. And the people of Benjamin did so and took their wives according to their number for the dancers whom they carried off. All right, verse 25. This is the close of the book of Judges. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." This is kind of where we started. When we began the book of Judges, we looked at that. There's no king. You can see here you have this rash vow, and then you have two comically legalistic fixes. Okay? We began the book of Judges by asking, what is the problem with not having a king? In other words, in Judges, you didn't have a king, and things really went to pieces. Is it because they didn't have a king? And so some would say, well, I mean, that's what happens. You can't have an ad hoc government like this. This is the way people behave. But if the people had actually followed the law of Moses, this would not have happened. God had made promises to them that he would take care of them and that they would be blessed in the land if they followed the law of Moses. They clearly are not. So the fact that they didn't have a king became a problem because they weren't following the law of Moses. Otherwise, if they did follow the law of Moses, they did have a king, and that would be God himself. Right? So in those days, Israel had no king, which wouldn't have been a problem had Israel been obedient. But Israel was not obedient. Since Israel was not obedient, it was a problem that they did not have a king. Do you see that? All right. Does having a king solve the problem? It depends. What kind of a king do you have? Because just because you have a king doesn't fix your problem if the king is not obedient. That will become the subject of 1st and 2nd Kings. What happens when the kings are disobedient? The people are already disobedient. Now the kings are disobedient, and the whole thing becomes a mess. But at least with the kings, we now and again see a halfway decent king. So now then we explore the connection between, well, what happens when you have a king and he doesn't follow the law of Moses? On the other hand, what happens when you have a king and he does? In the end, what God ultimately provided was a king, truly a king, and God himself in one man would rule over his people. This becomes sort of the theological foundations for what it means that Jesus is the Christ, or even the Son of God. The idea of the Son of God, that expression, we tend to think of, well, that's referring to the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, true God. But actually, and it does, upon occasion, refer to that. Jesus, in his divine connection to the Father, is true God. But the term Son of God was also applied to kings in the Old Testament. You will have that expression used. And to be the Son of God means you're God's agent. You're God's special agent in charge, meaning the king. Okay? So by Jesus referring to himself as the Son of God is not actually, generally, the focus there is not so much that he is the second person of the Trinity and a divine being, as much as it is he is the Christ. He is the one designated by God to rule, okay? He is the Son of God. Whereas, and this is strange, this is like the opposite of what you expect. When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, you would think, this is how people tend to think. It makes sense. When he says he's the Son of God, he's referring to his divine nature. When he refers himself to the Son of Man, he's referring to his human nature. It makes sense. It's actually almost reversed. When he calls himself the Son of God, what he's really referring to is his capacity as the designated king, the ruler that God sets on his holy hill and the nations rage against, as in Psalm 2. Now, when he calls himself the Son of Man, the reference is to Daniel chapter 7. And when you read Daniel chapter 7, it talks about one like a son of man. And when you read that passage, you see that one like the Son of Man is not like an ordinary human being. It talks about him, coming up to the right hand. It uses that expression of the Ancient of Days and receiving a kingdom and a dominion forever and ever. And he's with the clouds, it says. I mean, all this stuff that later gets drawn in to Jesus in his most majestic and glorious standing in Revelation, for example. I will come again, or he will come again with the clouds, the Son of Man. So the Son of Man was actually a very divine power, whereas the Son of God was a designation for the king. All right, I don't know how I got off on that. All right, Judges is an exploration of the beginnings of the working out of two chapters in the books of Moses. Leviticus 26 is a long chapter that begins with the blessings for obedience and finishes with the punishments for disobedience. Okay? If you read those chapters, if you've been doing the podcast, we went through that, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago or so. I'm not sure about that. But you will see that there's a very wonderful list of the blessings that will happen when you get into the land, if you are obedient. This is what I will do. And then a very horrifying list of all the terrible things that will happen if you are disobedient, and in particular if you go running after other gods. A very similar list in a very similar chapter in Deuteronomy chapter 28 is expounded by Moses, warning the people before they go into the promised land, look, wonderful things are waiting for you there, but you must be obedient to the Lord. If you go running after other gods, all bets are off. And in fact, this is what's going to happen, and it's just a very long and very dreary and sometimes horrifying list. What we have here is Judges is describing the deterioration of the people's faith in God and the relationship with him and their faithfulness to the covenant, the deterioration of that, and the concomitant deterioration of God's blessings, and the land is reverting back. They're becoming like the Canaanites that they displaced. Okay? And Benjamin and that whole business with Gibeah, I mean, all the way back to Sodom. I mean, this is a very, very bad thing that is happening to the people of God. In fact, even in that passage, if you recall, the Israelites themselves were shocked. They said, nothing like this has ever happened in Israel. They were shocked at the depravity of their own people. So this is meant to let us know that God is going to have to continue to be the rescuer of his people, first and foremost, from themselves. Okay? Israel's enemies are not external. Israel's enemies are herself. The external enemies just happen because Israel in themselves are degenerating. And it is exactly the same for us. I mean, our enemies are not the devil and the world. Okay? They can't touch us unless what? Unless we make deals with them, which we do. What happens is we cut ourselves off from the Lord, and we invite in the troubles of God's enemies and our own enemies. Okay? But if God is for us, who can be against us? Nobody can be against us. But if we're not for God, who is going to be our deliverer? So just as the people had to be saved from themselves over and over and over again while in the wilderness, now they have to be saved from themselves over and over and over again in the book of Judges. It won't stop here. Samuel and Kings, we're going to have the ongoing struggle of the people, and faithfulness to God is the issue. Idolatry or faithfulness to God. And ultimately what's going to happen is the ultimate punishments in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. Final punishments there are eviction from the land. And that will occur in 2 Kings chapter 17 and 24 and 25, with the destruction of the northern kingdom entirely and the exile of the southern kingdom. So this is a playing out of what God had threatened and what God had promised, and we are getting an early take on how it went. Okay? Any thoughts on Judges, or particularly on these last? These are grim chapters, aren't they?
Well, where it says everyone did what was right in his own eyes, I see that going on here in America, where we don't have absolute truth. People say, well, you have your truth and I have my truth, and I think that we are experiencing some of the same problems.
Well, you certainly see that in our culture today, we really have adopted, I mean, almost verbatim, everyone does what's right in his own eyes. I mean, what that used to mean is everybody does what he wants, whether it's right or wrong. In other words, you don't care whether it's right or wrong, you're going to take what you're going to take. But actually, what we're doing today is, no, we're not saying I can do what's wrong if that's okay. It's that I can decide for myself what's wrong and what's right, and so I will decide what's right and then do that. It's putting lipstick on a pig. It doesn't change anything in terms of the rightness or the wrongness of what we do. But what it does do is profoundly confuse and corrupt any hope of ever sort of bringing it back together again. If everybody is literally going to have their own gods and their own rights and their own wrongs and their own things, then the book of Judges starts to look pretty good, actually, compared to what we could end up in. Okay, let's just continue the live stream. We'll have